At its height, the Roman Empire was not merely a dominion of soldiers and senators. It was a machine of astonishing financial coordination. From the misty frontiers of Britannia to the deserts of Syria, taxes were assessed, silver coins circulated, and soldiers were paid with disciplined regularity. Roads carried not only legions but revenue. Ships crossing the Mediterranean did not just transport grain and marble, they moved value, obligation, and trust. Rome did not simply conquer territory. It monetized it. When we picture Rome, we tend to imagine triumphal arches, marble forums, and vast amphitheaters. Yet behind the spectacle stood a quieter architecture, a system of money that bound together diverse peoples under a single imperial economy. The denarius, ismal, silver, and stamped with imperial authority, became more than currency. It became a symbol of order. It represented a promise that the state stood behind the metal in your hand. This matters because empires are rarely sustained by force alone. Military power expands borders, but finance sustains them. The Roman state understood this early. Conquest brought spoils, gold, silver, land, slaves, but these were not simply consumed. They were absorbed into a monetary structure that allowed Rome to project power far beyond the reach of any single legion. Coini standardized trade. Taxation formalized obligation. Monetary trust stabilized exchange across thousands of miles. In many ways, Rome created one of the first truly integrated economic zones in Western history. A merchant in Gaul could transact with a trader in Alexandria using coinage recognized across the empire. This uniformity reduced friction and increased confidence. It fostered long-distance trade, deepened provincial integration, and reinforced Rome's authority not only politically, but financially. For a British audience, there is a familiar echo here. Centuries later, the pound sterling would underpin a global trading system stretching from India to Canada. Like Rome, Britain would discover that currency credibility can amplify influence far beyond domestic shores. Monetary power is a subtle but formidable instrument of empire. But Rome's system carried within it a fragile dependency, trust. Trust that the silver content of a coin was genuine. Trust that taxes would not become confiscatory. Trust that the status obligations could be met without distortion. For generations, a trust held firm. Expansion delivered fresh wealth. Provincial revenues flowed steadily. Military victories replenished the treasury. Yet the very success of expansion concealed a structural vulnerability. Rome's economy was deeply intertwined with conquest. New territories meant new resources, new tribute, and new streams of metal to mint into coin. But empires cannot expand indefinitely. Borders harden. Enemies resist. Costs rise. As Rome's territorial growth slowed, its financial obligations did not. The army remained vast. Infrastructure required maintenance. Administration grew more complex. The fiscal machine that had once thrived on influx began to strain under permanence. The empire shifted from rapid acquisition to long-term management, a far more expensive undertaking. It is at this moment, when growth slows but commitments remain, that the true test of any monetary system begins. Rome's leaders faced a choice familiar across history: reform spending, increase taxation, or alter the money itself. The decision they gradually made would ripple across centuries. The story of Rome's money is not merely about ancient coins. It is about how states balance ambition with discipline. It is about how credibility, once weakened, can erode silently before collapsing dramatically. And it is about a pattern repeated throughout financial history. When power becomes dependent on monetary manipulation rather than productive strength, decline begins not with invasion, but with erosion of trust. The Roman Empire did not fall in a single dramatic financial event. It unraveled slowly, as confidence in its monetary foundation began to crack. And in that slow erosion lies a lesson that echoes far beyond antiquity. At the core of Rome's financial strength stood a remarkably disciplined monetary structure. In the early Republic and into the first centuries of the Empire, Roman coinage was anchored in precious metal. The silver denarius became the backbone of daily commerce, while the gold aureus served larger state payments and international trade. Bronze and copper coins facilitated smaller transactions. Crucially, these coins possessed intrinsic value. Their worth was not abstract or symbolic, it was tied directly to measurable quantities of metal. This system offered two powerful advantages. First, it created uniformity across vast territories. Whether in Hispania, North Africa, or Britannia, Roman coinage carried consistent weight and purity. Secondly, it reinforced trust. A denarius was valuable not merely because Rome declared it so, but because its silver content could be verified. Confidence in the currency encouraged trade, taxation, and long-distance commercial integration. The Roman state financed itself through a combination of expansion and structured revenue collection. Conquest brought immense windfalls, gold and silver seized from defeated territories, tribute imposed upon provinces, and land redistributed to Roman elites. War spoils often flowed directly into the treasury, strengthening reserves and enabling further campaigns. Expansion, in financial terms, was self-reinforcing. Beyond conquest, Rome developed a complex taxation framework. Provinces paid land taxes and poll taxes. Customs duties were levied on goods crossing borders and ports. State-controlled mines, particularly in Spain and the Balkans, supplied precious metals. Agricultural output, especially grain from Egypt and North Africa, sustained urban populations and stabilized prices. Over time, this created a steady fiscal base, a system capable of maintaining roads, aqueducts, administrative networks, and, above all, the army. The military was the single largest recurring expense. Soldiers expected regular pay, bonuses upon accession of new emperors, and pensions upon retirement. As Rome expanded, so too did the number of legions required to defend its frontiers. Permanent garrisons replaced temporary campaigns. Defense became a standing financial obligation rather than a sporadic cost. For a time, the balance held. Revenue from provinces and state assets matched imperial commitments. However, as territorial expansion slowed in the 2nd century, new streams of conquest wealth diminished. The empire reached natural geographic limits. Borders stabilized along the Rhine, the Danube, and in the east. Without fresh inflows of plunder and tribute from newly subdued territories, Rome's fiscal model faced strain. Instead of restructuring expenditures or significantly reforming taxation, successive emperors turned to a subtler instrument, monetary adjustment. The silver content of the denarius began to decline. Initially modest, the reductions were barely perceptible. Over decades, however, the debasement accelerated. Coins contained less silver and more base metals, yet retained the same nominal value. This process functioned as a concealed form of revenue extraction. By reducing metal content while maintaining face value, the state effectively increased the number of coins it could mint from the same quantity of silver. It allowed emperors to meet payrolls and obligations without openly raising taxes. In the short term, it appeared efficient and politically convenient. Yet the consequences were profound. As coin purity declined, market participants began to notice. Merchants demanded more coins for goods. Prices adjusted upward. Older, purer coins were hoarded or melted down. Grisham's law, though not yet articulated, began to operate. Bad money drove good money out of circulation. Inflation gradually undermined purchasing power. Soldiers demanded higher wages to compensate for rising prices. The state responded with further debasement, deepening the cycle. What began as a tactical fiscal measure evolved into a structural weakness within the imperial system. Rome's monetary strength had always depended on credibility, on the belief that this coinage represented stable value. As the intrinsic link between silver content and face value weakened, so too did confidence. The fiscal architecture that had once underpinned imperial expansion was now being quietly reshaped by necessity. The mechanics of Rome's system reveal a recurring historical truth. When expansion ceases but obligations persist, governments often face the temptation to manipulate currency rather than confront structural imbalance. In Rome's case, this decision would carry consequences far beyond the mint. By the 3rd century, the consequences of decades of monetary dilution began to converge with mounting political instability. The Roman Empire entered what historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century, a period marked by rapid imperial succession, civil war, external invasion, and severe economic contraction. Yet beneath the visible turmoil lay a quieter collapse, the breakdown of monetary trust. Emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency, often elevated by military factions who demanded immediate financial reward. Each new ruler faced the same imperative: secure the loyalty of the legions. And loyalty required payment. Donatives, bonuses, and salary increases became political tools. To fund these promises, the state accelerated the debasement of coinage. The silver content of the once proud denarius fell dramatically, until it bore only a faint trace of its original purity. Inflation, once gradual, became acute. Prices rose rapidly. The purchasing power of wages eroded. In some regions, barter began to replace coin transactions altogether. Merchants, uncertain of the value of imperial currency, demanded payment in goods or in older, higher-quality coins. Economic integration across the empire began to fracture. Taxation became increasingly coercive. As the value of money weakened, the state demanded payments in kind, grain, livestock, manufactured goods, rather than unreliable coinage. These shifts signaled a profound regression. An empire that had once thrived on monetized exchange began reverting to a more primitive, localized economic structure. The fiscal machine that had sustained Roman dominance was losing its efficiency. At the same time, military expenditures continued to climb. The empire faced sustained pressure along its borders from Germanic tribes in the north and Persian forces in the east. Defense required manpower, fortifications, and logistics. Yet a shrinking tax base and collapsing currency limited the state's capacity to respond effectively. The erosion of confidence proved contagious. When citizens lose faith in money, they lose faith in the institutions that issue it. Economic uncertainty fed political instability, which in turn further destabilized the economy. Emperors struggled not only against external enemies but against internal fragmentation. Provinces declared breakaway regimes. Regional authorities assumed greater autonomy. Financial centralization weakened. Recognizing the severity of the crisis, Emperor Diocletian attempted sweeping reforms at the end of the 3rd century. He reorganized provincial administration, sought to stabilize taxation, and introduced new coinage intended to restore monetary credibility. Most famously, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, an ambitious attempt to curb inflation by imposing price controls across the empire. Yet price controls cannot restore trust. They address symptoms, not structural causes. Merchants often ignored the edict or withdrew goods from markets rather than sell at mandated prices. Enforcement proved difficult across vast territories. While Diocletian's reforms temporarily strengthened administrative order, they did not fully reverse decades of monetary deterioration. The deeper problem lay in the imbalance between imperial commitments and productive capacity. Rome had constructed a system dependent on continuous revenue expansion. Once expansion ceased and debasement replaced discipline, the monetary foundation weakened irreversibly. Even as later emperors introduced new gold coins, such as the solidus under Constantine, the empire had already undergone structural transformation. Economic vitality shifted eastward. The western provinces grew increasingly fragile. Rome did not collapse overnight. Its institutions lingered. Its armies fought on. But the fiscal cohesion that had once bound the empire together was fractured. Trade networks shrank. Urban populations declined. Administrative complexity became burdensome rather than efficient. The turning point was not a single invasion or assassination. It was the cumulative loss of monetary credibility. The Roman state had attempted to sustain imperial ambition through currency manipulation rather than structural reform. In doing so, it undermined the very trust upon which its authority depended. By the time external pressures intensified in the 5th century, the impetus financial resilience had already been compromised. The marble monuments still stood, but the economic system that sustained them had been hollowed from within. And once trust in money falters, the architecture of power soon follows. The story of Rome's monetary decline is not simply an ancient curiosity. It is a recurring pattern in the history of power. Empires do not rely solely on armies, geography, or ideology. They rely on financial credibility. When a state's currency commands trust, its influence expands beyond its borders. When that trust weakens, authority contracts, often long before formal political collapse. Rome demonstrated a principle that would echo across centuries: monetary dominance underpins geopolitical dominance. The denarius once facilitated trade across 3 continents, integrating diverse economies into a unified imperial system. Confidence in Roman coinage reduced transaction costs, strengthened tax collection, and reinforced loyalty. In many ways, Rome's monetary credibility was as vital as its legions. Centuries later, Britain would build its own global system upon similar foundations. The pound sterling became central to international trade, insurance, and finance. The City of London emerged as a nexus of banking power, extending British influence far beyond territorial holdings. Even as the British Empire economy began to contract in the 20th century, sterling's role in global markets prolonged Britain's financial relevance. The parallel is not exact, but the pattern is recognizable. Monetary trust magnifies power. It allows states to borrow more easily, to project influence more subtly, and to sustain commitments that might otherwise prove unsustainable. Yet this strength contains an inherent vulnerability. If political leaders rely too heavily on currency manipulation or debt expansion to maintain stability, they risk eroding the very credibility that sustains them. Rome's mistake was not immediate recklessness. Debasement began gradually, almost imperceptibly. Reduction in silver content appeared manageable, even rational. Faced with mounting military costs and slowing territorial expansion, emperors chose expedience over structural reform. They avoided drastic spending cuts or politically dangerous tax overhauls. Instead, they altered the coin. In the short term, the strategy worked. Soldiers were paid. Obligations were met. Political crises were postponed. But over time, the cumulative effect proved corrosive. Inflation accelerated. Confidence weakened. Economic coordination fragmented. What had once been a sophisticated monetary system devolved into instability and coercion. The broader lesson is neither alarmist nor simplistic. Currency dilution alone does not topple empires. Yet persistent reliance on financial manipulation signals deeper imbalance. When state expenditure consistently outpaces productive capacity, leaders confront limited options. They may reform, retrench, or conceal strain through monetary adjustment. History shows that concealment often prevails, until it no longer can. Debt cycles, though, follow this rhythm. States expand commitments during periods of growth and confidence. When growth slows, debt accumulates. Servicing that debt requires either higher taxation, increased productivity, or financial engineering. The temptation to rely on the latter is perennial. Rome's experience illustrates how such choices, repeated over decades, can weaken systemic resilience. For modern observers of UK finance history, the Roman case invites reflection rather than comparison. Britain's imperial influence shifted as the pound sterling's global dominance waned. Financial power adapted, relocating from territorial empire to international banking networks. The transition was complex, shaped by global wars and economic transformation. Yet the underlying principle remains: monetary credibility is not permanent. It must be maintained through discipline, transparency, and productive strength. Rome's decline was not a dramatic monetary collapse in a single year. It was a slow erosion of trust, a subtle weakening of the bond between state and citizen, coin and value. By the time political and military fractures became undeniable, the financial foundation had already shifted. In the end, money is more than a medium of exchange. It is an expression of institutional integrity. It reflects the balance between ambition and capacity. Rome's experience reminds us that empires endure not merely through conquest, but through credibility. And when credibility falters, even the mightiest structures can gradually lose their cohesion. History rarely repeats in identical form, but it often rhymes. The Roman impetus monetary experiment stands as a testament to the enduring relationship between money and power, and to the quiet, decisive role finance plays in the lifespan of empires.